Jackie Combs is the White House editor for the Los Angeles Times Washington Bureau. Previously, a New York Times national correspondent covering politics and policy, and at the Wall Street Journal for 18 years, covering the Clinton and Bush administrations. Jackie was a Shorenstein Fellow in the spring of 2015, where her work focused on conservative media. Jackie Combs, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Why did you take such a deep dive into conservative media?
Well, as you sort of noted, I was in Washington, had been in Washington for years, covering White Houses and Congress, and drinking water from a fire hose of information all the time. And I was getting this sense that conservative media was a huge influence in what was happening in Congress and in White Houses. And so I got this call from the Shorenstein Center to be a fellow, but I didn't have a research topic. So I was giving it some thought, and one day I went to lunch with the former Senate Majority Leader, Trent Lott, Republican of Mississippi. He said, you know, what he wanted to do is do what the Democrats did. In the 70s, they were like a leftist party, and starting in the 80s as their reaction to Reagan, and then culminating with Clinton, they became a center-left party, more moderate than they had been. And it worked for them. They were, you know, electing presidents. They were majority. They did lose their majority. And in any case, the Democrats had moderated. Trent Lott says to me, we should do that, but we can't, because unlike the Democrats, we've got this conservative media that every time we start to moderate, they jump on us and prevent it, and they scare the members of Congress, and we go farther right instead of moving toward the center. So I thought, there's my topic.
But how would you compare anti-establishment branch of the Republican Party's stronghold on the media 2 years ago when you had that conversation and then did the research, including the presidential campaign and election that took place amazingly almost a year ago? So from then till now, how would you compare the two?
Well, briefly, I'll even go back farther to 20 years ago when Fox News was starting out and Rush Limbaugh was really making a name for himself nationally. Then they were completely in league with the Republican establishment, Republican leaders, so much so that when the House Republicans took over the majority in 1995, after the 94 midterm elections, they made Rush Limbaugh an honorary member of their Republican caucus. And what happened is, it's a factor of audience. And they had so fed red meat to this audience for 20 years that they, you know, conflict is good. And when, to feed this beast, the Republican leaders would make promises that they knew they couldn't keep when they couldn't keep them. For instance, more recently, repeal Obamacare, defund Planned Parenthood, balance the budget. None of these things happened, and they knew they couldn't make it happen. So it feeds a frustration, which created this anti-establishment feeling that the conservative media figures were only too happy to foment. So that you now, in 2017, unlike 21 years ago, it pays to be anti-establishment. Now, Trump has sort of complicated that because he is the establishment.
Well, let me ask you this. I'm wondering if that red meat has been amped up and if technology's played a role, what has? And so the question really is, has the Trump presidency, now almost a year old from November, fueled, or how is it fueled, the likes of Fox and Breitbart?
Well, it's interesting. It's on the one hand, he feeds them, although, you know, the people go online, they go on social media, and so these radio figures have gone on to digital as well with websites, but you've had this proliferation. What has made conservative media what it is today largely is that it doesn't take much to create a website. The Breitbart and Blaze and Daily Caller.
And you've contended that Democrats and liberals don't typically look to the media for guidance, and so they aren't necessarily as easily influenced as, let's say, the Republicans are. So do you still feel that way given the, let's say, popular support for Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders during his run for the presidency, and, as you were saying before, the public's response to Trump's dismantling of Obamacare and
Right.
the reaction to DACA. So do you still think that Democrats and liberals are not as influenced by media?
Yeah, and in fact, I think the examples you cite illustrate the forces that they do respond to. What I found in my research, which I still think is true, is that from the left to the right, people with any knowledge of this, the media ecosystems, agree that Democratic-leaning voters are not as likely to look to like-minded media outlets for their information. Now, of course, people who are on the left are going to prefer MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, Huffington Post, but it's not with the same, they get their news from a wide variety of sources. They're more responsive to, than people on the right, they're more responsive to organizations, progressive organizations, labor unions, groups like Planned Parenthood, the political arm of Planned Parenthood.
Right. So just to switch a little bit, you've worked for the Wall Street Journal, of course, for a long time, and then and today, it's considered by many people to be conservative. First of all, I'm going to ask you, is it? And then, how does that kind of conservative journalism compare to what we're talking about now?
Yeah. Well, the Wall Street Journal is sort of like royalty among old school conservative media. But I should say, you know, having spent 18 years there covering Washington and nearly 9 years at the New York Times doing the same, the point is I did the same. I did nothing as a reporter for those two papers, one considered conservative, one considered liberal. As a journalist, I did nothing different at the Wall Street Journal from what I would subsequently do at the New York Times. The difference is in the editorial pages. And I was never asked to do anything different by either paper, put a slant on a story. It's sort of seen as an establishment paper. Things have become so anti-establishment on the right that the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and even Fox News in some respects, is seen as too pro-establishment. They are seen as part of the establishment.
I mean, I almost want you to repeat that.
You know, you see, she's gone now, but Megyn Kelly was seen by many viewers of Fox and non-viewers, because on the right, as way to establishment. Bret Baier and some of the other, and Chris Wallace, who I consider quite good journalists, they are constantly being criticized by people on the right. And so there's a good deal, I mean, for all of what most of us think of as Fox as being the king of conservative media, there are a lot of conservatives, activists, who have become now so anti-establishment and so militantly, I don't know if you can even call it conservatism, they wouldn't, that they think Fox News is too much establishment center.
Turning to the still, for many of us, cherished idea of, you know, a fourth estate and a free press. Was there ever really a golden age of journalism? And do you think that there will be another golden age of journalism or anything like it for your children and our grandchildren?
As for the future, I wish I could be optimistic. I think things are going to be as bad or worse before or if they get better, but I have a caveat on that. But I do think that we have lived, you and I, in our lifetimes in a golden age of journalism. I think I entered journalism in the late 70s, early 80s in a golden age. It was, because in journalism, we think now of having partisan media, you know, that was the rule for most of our history from the late 18th through the 20th century. Papers were formed in many cases by, well, Jefferson and Hamilton, as we've, you know, with the popularity of the musical Hamilton, they sponsored their respective editors so that they would get their point of view out. That changed in the 20th century, started changing prior to World War II, but then really took off after World War II because people had more education. High school was not a thing for a lot of people before World War II. It became more and more of a thing. People got education, and journalism was seen as something that really was recording history, trying to do it in a truthful way. And increasingly, as journalists became more educated, frankly, and there came to be this idea that it was a public mission, and I still see it as a mission.
Jackie Combs, White House editor for the Los Angeles Times Bureau and Shorenstein Fellow. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's always an interesting topic, and you have a great station.
Thank you.